Hi, my name is Morgan Mercer, and I'm the CEO and founder of Vantage Point, a company that creates experiences that transform the way that you think. Thank you so much for joining my Games for a Change talk today. And we're really excited to dive into connecting humanity, XR's accessibility as a feature, where we discuss the way that COVID-19 has impacted the world at large and what that means in terms of how XR's level of accessibility can really transform and change the way that we look at learning, education, and training. Virtual reality, accessibility is a feature. So virtual reality allows accessibility no matter the environment or where you are in the world to gain firsthand exposure to different use cases, environments, lifestyles, and experiences. We call this accessibility as a feature, which is thinking through the demographics and designing with various environments and how scalability impacts them in mind. The way that we at Vantage Point incorporate this, for example, in some of our experiences is thinking through subtitles, right? So for trainees or participants who could be immersed in an environment within a corporate office throughout the world, going through training, who might be hard of hearing, we have other alternatives for engaging and interacting with the environment and the training curriculum through things like subtitles or different ways to interact and control branching narrative story structures within the training experience. So some participants can use a controller, some participants can't. And we think through accessibility in terms of how we actually design the functionality and the usage of our products from a use case perspective. This is really important as companies within the XR space, as we begin to think through who the end user is and how we're actually designing various systems within the metaverse to support end users, both from, again, a feature and usage perspective of functionality, interactivity within an experience, but also accessibility from the perspective of safety, right? How can we drive higher accessibility for different groups, meaning youth, K through 12, women, by thinking through systems of safety within the metaverse and systems of accountability. And as designers within XR, these are all core responsibilities falling on behalf of the companies. So, COVID-19 has really forced accessibility in training and education and learning. Historically, we've always maybe potentially relied on other ways of training that weren't necessarily accessible to other populations. And now we have accessibility as a benefit, which allows us to experience things that we otherwise never would. So myself, as a biracial woman, I may not necessarily have the same experiences as a first generation immigrant because that's not my reality. That wasn't my background. But with XR and the accessibility component of XR, we actually have the ability to step into alternative realities and embody different environments and be able to interact in different ways and come away from the experience with different levels of awareness and new learnings, which creates accessibility in human connection. So, again, while historically we may have relied on other ways of training and education as a core pillar, this may have been exclusionary to those who couldn't engage. So, for example, historically, we may have done in-person seminars or role playing in an educational capacity, but COVID-19 has forced education to shift and change gears. And so we now see this with all conferences being hybrid, distance learning, remote collaboration tools, and of course, how XR has allowed people to train without ever having to go to a facility or enroll in the same programs which they may not be able to afford. So, what we've seen is a drop in headset costs, a rise in access and use cases, which brings access to participants all over the world who, again, may never have been able to go to a class or may never have been able to go to a workplace environment and train in the same way or, be on site with their employers, actually practicing something hard skills related or soft skills related. And what the question I would like to pose to the audience here today is, could this potentially become the shift that we see with the microfinancing economy, where education and training continue to be more accessible globally? So think about how this could impact the MBA, where we have MBA on demand or on the go, where trainees and participants in a higher education context or capacity can then do things like job shadowing or MBA programs in their free time, where trainees who maybe don't have the time or don't have the financial resources to actually pay for a traditional MBA program have the accessibility through reduction in costs and increase in access to being able to do it at home in their own time outside of whatever their day-to-day job is, to go through the same in-person training simulations that they would otherwise do in a real life job shadowing application. So, again, accessibility is really a core feature of XR. And I believe that the shift that we're going to see in the coming years is going to be very similar to how the microfinancing economy has really increased access and use cases for various demographics and populations who otherwise couldn't have access to things that they did before. So imagine how this could impact education outcomes, in other countries, and imagine how this could really impact the way that we train and educate in the USA, right? With training, people can now tune in from anywhere and learn any skill. It creates the space to fail safely. So that's access to greater awareness within ourselves. As an individual who goes into an immersive training program, you have the ability to learn collaboratively with other trainees and participants in other environments, but you also have the ability to have safety as a feature in the sense of being able to have the space to self-reflect and the space to be wrong. So again, the space to fail safely actually leads to greater accessibility because we can access different parts of ourselves that we weren't aware of. And it leads to greater awareness and insight within ourselves, i.e., who are we really and how do we show up in the world? And how can we access that within ourselves to grow and develop and change? So outside of some of the standard use cases like traveling, exposure to, and the ability to tune in across the world remotely, learning in conjunction with distance learners from anywhere in the world, this also enables greater and learning outcomes. It enables trainees and participants to be educated in various environments in conjunction with management and staff independently, access to greater awareness and insights. And the way that we at Vantage Point think about accessibility is how can we maximize the impact of all of our training programs? How can we make this not necessarily just a one-to-one program, but a one-to-many impact through the design and development of the course that we create? And we view this as the 6 degrees of XR, right? So again, how can this not just be a one-to-one impact where a participant or trainee goes into a program and then goes out and is impacted or shifted, or something has changed or they've learned something within our program, but how do we then take that and view that as how this participant and how this trainee is then going out and interacting within the world with their colleagues, with people in day-to-day interactions, and how are we using that to transform humanity? And so again, this is what we call the 6 degrees of XR. And the question I would really pose to the audience here is, who is your end user truly, right? Because you have a purchaser or the person who procures the product, you have an end user, and then the end user again interacts within the world more broadly. So for example, we have anti-sexual harassment training where we focus on combating common biases, which are research backed through each of the courses and modules. And our view for this is if we can shift bias and perception around women and gender diversity, we will achieve higher outcomes and embedded learnings in our immersive anti-sexual harassment training. So the way that we actually develop this is we work with law firms, we work with clinical SMEs, we work with trauma-informed communications experts. We base it in research around power dynamics and gender studies and case law and first-person reports and interviews. Because again, we understand that this topic is not just the training curriculum that's compliance mandated. We understand that power dynamics and our understanding of gender-related stereotypes and power normalization actually influences how likely we are to rationalize away, a behavior that is discriminatory or potentially harassment towards an individual. So as a 6 degrees of XR principle, the way that we think through creating the training is at first, how can we actually shift our understanding, create greater levels of access to our awareness of how we view gender normative stereotypes? And then how does that inform the educational and learning outcomes that we have for our training programs, right? And in this, we also recognize that agency is a really important component of this. So, again, within XR and accessibility as a core feature of XR, we have the ability to give participants the agency to realize that their actions influence the environment around them, and their outcomes are directly related to the actions they do or don't take. And agency is such a core component of anti-sexual harassment training, wherein typically within power dynamics, it's an attempt to take somebody's agency or their power away. So by giving individuals agency, we empower them and embolden them to realize that their actions can influence others. So these are all core components of accessibility. And, realistically, this is actually a very delicate and powerful scale, right? So for us, the question that we always think is what level of access and for what learning objectives? A lot of times the questions we get are, do you do first person POVs? POV means point of view. Do you do bystander? What POVs do you do? And so for us, the question depends on the training line that we create, right? And I'll hit on that in a second. But for us, coming back to the term agency, which I discussed briefly in the last slide, what was really important to us in this training line was not doing first person embodiments, because the reality is that unfortunately the majority of men and women likely have experienced some form of harassment in some variants on the spectrum. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't developing something that the brain could embed as triggering. And so again, with accessibility and access to different experiences that we may not otherwise have in reality and real life, right outside of a VR environment, it comes with really great responsibility and great power, right? So again, it's a very delicate and powerful scale that we have to tiptoe and that we really have to evaluate, which again comes back to the question, what level of access for what level of learning objectives? So, to hit on diversity and inclusion training, which I'll touch on next, it's one of the other training verticals we offer. With that, we actually decided to do first person POV experiences where you can actually feel what it feels like to have a security officer, racially profile you as you're leaving the office for the day. And so a lot of people ask us, what was behind your decision to do first person POV experiences for diversity and inclusion training, but not for anti-sexual harassment training? And for us, when we think through the power in the scale and in the spectrum, not only do we look at it from a research-based perspective and also from a numerical perspective, right? What's the probability that, the population or end user group has experienced this experience? What level of discomfort would be reasonable as represented by first person interviews or private, surveys conducted with that specific population or group of BIPOC employees, women, people who've reported sexual harassment claims within companies, etc. What are they telling us? Are they telling us that they would, find this as something that would create a level of awareness amongst colleagues, or are they telling us that they would find this as something, that would push the envelope too far, right? And so for us, it's really important for every company in thinking through accessibility and using XR to think about the power behind it and really be intentional with the way that you design it, and make sure that you're involving trauma-informed communications experts, psychologists, clinicians, developing clinical trials around it to ensure that you're leveraging accessibility in the right way. Because, you want to make sure that you're creating the level of access that's helpful for creating the learning objectives, but you're not accidentally or, unintentionally actually working against yourself in trying to provide access, but doing it in a way that's not thoughtfully designed. So to hit on diversity and inclusion training, which is one of the other training verticals that we provide, we focused on a skills-based approach. And some of the skills that we'll think about are self-awareness, self-reflection, empathy, and role-specific behavioral change and tactics that employees and employers, managers, et cetera, can actually implement within their companies. The way that we view this is if we can actually build up people's skills, we can create more accountable and self-aware individuals who can lean into situations of discomfort, exclusionary behavior, bias, etc., even if they don't understand fully why something is wrong or how something is wrong or what to do, which is where the learning journey begins. So, we understand that, again, with accessibility, every single person starts at various levels of understanding and awareness. Everybody doesn't come to the table with the same level of understanding, the same background, the same level of cultural competency. And we take this into account in both the way that the curriculum is designed from a content perspective and also the way that the curriculum is designed from a functionality perspective, meaning we provide different levels of training depending on the level that somebody is at in terms of their level of education. Some people may know what bias is. Some people may know different types of bias and how bias shows up, right? And so it's very important for us to understand how people come to the table with their different levels of awareness so that we can increase access to learning, through the programs that we create. So, within our diversity and inclusion experiences, we do believe that in terms of access, it is important to be able to have first person, bystander, and fly on the wall experiences that somebody would otherwise never experience, because that's what we were told as we conducted, interviews and studies and, did actual research behind how we could move the needle forward and create a better sense of relatability and accountability across some of these topics. And when we created this program, we were thinking about accessibility also in terms of the audiences that we're training. So with the companies that we work with this program, we actually are working across the US and Europe. And so we're deploying it worldwide across 30 countries. And so for us, we understood that accessibility to education and learning materials also meant understanding that, again, different countries have different cultural competencies, have different histories, have different backgrounds, different immigration patterns, etc. So we actually worked with anthropologists as we designed these programs to look at the ways that different groups migrated, how that might impact, what was reflected in society at large on a country to country basis, and then how that could impact a specific person's perception on diversity and inclusion, right? Or how the political structure of the country could impact a person's perception on diversity and inclusion. Well, everybody has the same thing. So there's no way that we could have anything that's exclusionary, right? Not necessarily true. And that can be, one of the thought patterns that we've heard from, some countries potentially out of Europe, right? And so for us, we thought through accessibility from the perspective of, again, who at the end of the day is going to be going through the training program, and what do we need to understand about the way that they think to unlock greater learning outcomes for them. So again, the thing that I would encourage everybody in the audience to understand is that accessibility is power. It enables us to relate to the world at large. And in doing that, we have the ability to come together in a more connected and human way. So, again, when you're designing on the scale of accessibility and thinking through the powerful, the dynamic, the complex, and, the really great scale of accessibility and the way that impacts the products you design, the way that you design, who is the end user really? Because again, we always have the people we're putting into our training programs, but then there's always an extra layer of the way that they interface with clients, the way that they interface with people who come into their stores, the way that they interface with people in day-to-day interactions in the world at large. So, thinking through accessibility in terms of the way that the program is designed, making sure that everybody has access and usage to it. Accessibility is a feature of XR, making sure that everybody understands that XR can unlock additional learning and training capabilities and components for people who otherwise would never be able to train or learn or be educated in the same way. And then accessibility from a curriculum and content design perspective, understanding that there's power in accessibility of creating different levels of awareness or opportunities for new experiences for people, but also understanding that should only be used very delicately to drive learning objectives to create greater accessibility and connection within the world more broadly. So the way that we think through a few other types of training is we think through training encompassing increasing awareness and learning outcomes around lack of access in various verticals and sectors like education, medical, so thinking through lack of accessibility and effective care, right, within the medical sector, disabilities, and training around neurodiversity. So as you think through the way that XR can really help create accessibility in the world, again, I relate it back to the 6 degrees of separation. Not only do think about the question of how do these outcomes impact on a one-to-one basis and a one-to-many basis, but again, how do employees take this back to clients and back to the world? Thank you for tuning in. I'm Morgan Mercer, the founder and CEO of Vantage Point. We create experiences that transform the way that you think, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Games for Change conference.